Imagine being born into a world where your freedom is not your own, a world where every choice you make, every step you take, could be controlled by someone else. From the moment of birth, your life is not considered yours. It belongs to another. This was the harsh reality for millions of people throughout history who lived under chattel slavery. Chattel slavery, the ownership of humans and their offspring as property, forced people to work without pay, and the condition was inheritable across generations. It is one of the darkest chapters in human history, yet it is often misunderstood or oversimplified in the stories we hear today. When we hear the word slavery, many of us immediately think of the transatlantic slave trade or the American South. While these events were tragic and significant, they are only part of a much broader history. Long before European powers crossed the Atlantic, various civilizations around the world enslaved people, sometimes for labor, sometimes for military service, and sometimes even for entertainment. People were considered property, not individuals with rights or agency. Their value was measured in labor, obedience, or even physical beauty, and their children were born into the same condition, trapped in a cycle they did not choose. In Eastern and Central Europe, for example, Slavs were targeted for enslavement for centuries. Empires, kingdoms, and conquerors viewed them as easy prey due to the lack of a unified state or central defense. Families were separated, communities torn apart, and people forced into grueling labor or military service under strict control. The term slave itself may even trace back to the word Slav, highlighting how central their experience was in the history of forced servitude. These enslaved people were not just numbers in a ledger, they were fathers, mothers, children, people with hopes and dreams abruptly stolen by circumstances beyond their control. Understanding this history is not just about remembering suffering, it is about recognizing resilience, the human capacity to endure unimaginable hardships, and the stories that history often overlooks. It is a chance to acknowledge the forgotten voices and to confront the complexities of human societies across time. The chains may have been physical, but they also represent the social, political, and economic structures that allowed slavery to persist for centuries. Today, as we reflect on these stories, we invite you to journey through history with us, not to dwell solely on the darkness, but to learn, question, and understand. By exploring these past experiences, we gain perspective on the freedoms we often take for granted, and we honor those who lived through struggles that shaped the world we inhabit now. If you find this story compelling and want to uncover more hidden chapters of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you do not miss our next exploration into the untold stories of the past. Your support helps us continue sharing these important narratives with clarity, depth, and respect for the people who lived them. When we examine the story of slavery, it is easy to fall into the trap of seeing it as a European invention, a unique horror tied solely to the transatlantic slave trade and the colonization of the Americas. For many, the word slavery evokes images of African men and women bound in chains, crossing the Atlantic on overcrowded ships, forced into labor on plantations under the scorching sun. While these events were undeniably brutal and historically significant, focusing solely on this narrative risks obscuring a far richer, more complex tapestry of human experience. Slavery, in its many forms, has been a persistent feature of civilizations across the world, practiced extensively by societies that were separated by continents, languages, and religions, yet all driven by similar forces of conquest, wealth, and social hierarchy. Long before the first European ships reached the shores of West Africa, ancient empires had developed sophisticated systems for capturing, buying, and selling human beings. The Romans, for example, enslaved people from the farthest reaches of their empire, including Slavs from Eastern Europe, as part of their strategy to consolidate power and exploit labor. These slaves were not simply workers in the fields. They served in households, built monumental architecture, and performed in arenas. Their lives commodified in ways that were shocking even by the standards of their own time. The Byzantine Empire, which succeeded the Romans in the East, continued this practice, often enslaving their own Christian neighbors as part of political and military campaigns. These systems of enslavement were complex and highly organized, demonstrating that the ownership of humans as property was not an isolated practice, but rather a recurring strategy for controlling populations throughout history. The patterns of enslavement extended beyond Europe. In the Islamic world, slavery was deeply embedded in both economic and social structures for nearly 1,000 years. Muslim empires, stretching from North Africa to the Indian subcontinent, engaged in the capture and trade of slaves on a scale that rivaled, and in many cases surpassed, the European Atlantic trade. These enslaved people included Africans, Europeans, and peoples from the Middle East and Central Asia, reflecting a system that was as vast geographically as it was diverse culturally. Slaves were used in multiple capacities, from skilled labor to administrative roles, and while some could rise through the ranks under certain conditions, the majority lived under severe restrictions and endured brutal treatment. The intricate regulations surrounding who could be enslaved, based on religion and social status, added layers of complexity to this system, illustrating that the motives for slavery were often tied to societal structures rather than mere economic exploitation. Even within Europe, the story of the Slavs reminds us that slavery was not an aberration unique to a single region or period. For centuries, Slavic peoples were taken captive by conquering armies, sold in market, and forced into generational servitude, a practice that shaped entire regions socially and economically. Families were torn apart, communities destabilized, and cultural traditions disrupted. Yet the resilience of these communities endured, leaving traces in historical records and linguistic etymology. The very word slave may derive from Slav, underscoring the centrality of their experience in the broader narrative of human bondage. This example demonstrates that while the Atlantic slave trade captured global attention, similar systems had been entrenched in human societies long before, with comparable human cost and moral complexity. Slavery in Africa itself was multifaceted, existing long before European intervention. Many African societies engaged in slavery through internal conflicts, debt, and other social mechanisms, trading captives with neighbors or integrating them into households and local economies. When Europeans arrived, they did not invent slavery. Rather, they tapped into existing networks, intensifying and redirecting them for colonial exploitation in the Americas. The tragedy of this period lies not only in the suffering inflicted by Europeans but also in how local, regional, and global systems of power intertwined, demonstrating that the institution of slavery was a deeply woven human phenomenon rather than the product of a single culture or people. The enduring lesson is that slavery, in its various forms, reflects recurring human tendencies toward domination, control, and the commodification of life. Across continents and centuries, societies develop mechanisms to exploit vulnerable populations, often justifying these actions through religion, law, or cultural norms. By recognizing the global prevalence of slavery, we gain a deeper appreciation for the resilience of those who endured it and the complexity of the historical systems that perpetuated it. The story of the Slavs, the Africans, the captives in the Islamic world, and countless others reminds us that the past is not a single narrative but a mosaic of experiences, suffering, and survival, each deserving of study and reflection. In exploring this interconnected history, we are compelled to challenge the narratives we often accept uncritically, to see beyond a Eurocentric perspective, and to understand slavery as a universal human issue that transcended geography and time. It was not unique, and it was not inevitable. It was a product of power structures, social hierarchies, and economic ambitions that existed across civilizations. By acknowledging the diversity of slavery's history, we honor the memories of those who lived under these conditions and gain insight into the ways human societies have grappled with freedom, coercion, and morality throughout the ages. In the vast expanse of Eastern and Central Europe, long before the rise of modern nation-states, the Slavic peoples lived as scattered communities, often divided by rivers, forests, and tribal boundaries, yet bound together by language, culture, and shared ancestry. These lands, rich in resources and strategically located between empires, became the stage for one of the most enduring and tragic chapters of human history, the enslavement of the Slavs. For thousands of years, these communities were caught in the relentless currents of conquest and subjugation, becoming targets for multiple empires that sought to exploit them for labor, tribute, and political advantage. The story of the Slavs is not merely a tale of suffering. It is a lens through which we can understand the mechanisms of power, the vulnerability of decentralized populations, and the ways in which human societies have historically treated one another as property rather than as fellow humans. The Romans were among the earliest external powers to systematically enslave Slavic populations. As the Roman Republic expanded its reach into the eastern territories of Europe, it encountered a mosaic of tribal societies, many of which were neither unified nor capable of mounting coordinated resistance. To the Romans, these people represented both a threat and an opportunity. They could be subdued, their labor harnessed, and their very lives transformed into commodities to fuel the empire's ambitions. Slavs captured in these campaigns were transported across vast distances, sold in market, and forced into agricultural work, construction, and domestic service. Their labor helped to build cities, maintain the sprawling infrastructure of the empire, and provide the manpower necessary for Rome's armies and public spectacles. In this way, the Slavs became integral, if invisible, contributors to one of history's most remarkable civilizations, their individual identities subsumed under the impersonal logic of empire and economic gain. When the Western Roman Empire fell and the Byzantine Empire rose in the east, the cycle of enslavement did not end. The Byzantines, heirs to Roman administrative sophistication and military discipline, continued the practice of taking Slavs as slaves, integrating them into both civilian and military systems. These enslaved Slavs were employed in agricultural estates, workshops, and urban households, but many were also conscripted into military service, practice that illustrates the complex social dynamics of slavery in this period. The Byzantines often preferred Christian slaves from nearby regions, which meant that Slavic Christians could find themselves subordinated by other Christians, blurring the lines of religious solidarity and emphasizing the primacy of political and economic calculations over moral or spiritual considerations. This context sheds light on a recurring theme in the history of slavery: the tension between shared identity and the imperatives of power, where cultural or religious affinity offered little protection against exploitation. Beyond the Romans and Byzantines, the Bulgars also played a role in the enslavement of Slavic populations. As these early medieval powers expanded, Slavic communities were frequently caught between competing forces, their lands and resources coveted by larger and more organized neighbors. Slavic tribes faced raids, forced conscription, and sales into distant markets, their fates determined less by their own choices than by the ambitions of empires whose leaders viewed human lives as instruments of statecraft and profit. The Bulgars, like the Byzantines and Romans before them, participated in a system where captives could be turned into soldiers, laborers, or property, perpetuating a cycle of subjugation that extended across generations. What makes the history of Slavic enslavement particularly compelling is the longevity and continuity of the practice. For centuries, the Slavs endured repeated incursions, each wave of conquest leaving its mark on social structures, cultural traditions, and familial networks. Children born to enslaved parents inherited the status of their parents, ensuring that entire generations were bound to the conditions imposed by external powers. This generational aspect of slavery created a society in which personal freedom was systematically denied, yet human resilience persisted. Communities adapted, resisted, and in some cases, found ways to preserve cultural identity despite the pressures of enslavement. The persistence of Slavic languages, customs, and communal memory in the face of such exploitation attests to a remarkable human capacity for endurance. The experience of the Slavs also highlights broader patterns in the history of slavery across Europe and beyond. Their story demonstrates how vulnerability, whether due to political fragmentation, geographic isolation, or lack of military organization, made certain populations more susceptible to enslavement, a pattern observable in many regions and eras. It also illustrates how slavery was not limited to racial or religious distinctions. Instead, it often emerged from strategic calculations, economic incentives, and the structural needs of empires. Slavs were enslaved by other Europeans, by empires that shared their religion or culture, showing that the mechanisms of oppression were complex and multifaceted, driven more by power than by prejudice alone. Moreover, the historical record of Slavic enslavement provides insight into the human cost of political and economic ambition. Families were torn apart, local economies disrupted, and cultural practices threatened. The psychological and social toll of such sustained subjugation was immense. Yet the survival of Slavic communities and their cultural heritage underscores a narrative of resilience alongside tragedy. Understanding this history allows us to see slavery not merely as an isolated atrocity, but as an institution embedded in the fabric of human societies, one that could persist for millennia and shape the destinies of entire peoples. Ultimately, the story of the Slavs in Eastern and Central Europe reminds us that slavery is not a single narrative confined to one region, one race, or one period of history. It is a recurring human phenomenon, tied to power, conquest, and economic necessity, but also marked by endurance, adaptation, and cultural survival. By tracing the experiences of the Slavs under Romans, Byzantines, and Bulgars, we gain a clearer understanding of how systemic enslavement functioned, how it affected real communities, and how those communities managed to survive and preserve their identity despite centuries of subjugation. Their story is a testament to the complexities of human history, where suffering and resilience coexist, and where the legacies of the past continue to inform our understanding of freedom, power, and humanity itself. Language often carries the echoes of history, and few words in the English language are as telling of human suffering as the word slave. Its etymology reaches deep into the medieval landscapes of Europe, where the lives of millions of Slavic peoples were transformed by conquest, subjugation, and forced labor. Scholars suggest that the term slave itself is likely derived from the word Slav, a reflection of the central role that Slavic populations played in the systems of enslavement that spanned centuries and empires. This linguistic connection is more than a simple coincidence. It serves as a linguistic monument to a history of captivity, one where entire communities were defined, at least in the eyes of their oppressors, by the misfortune of being conquered and exploited. In tracing the origins of the word, we encounter a mosaic of historical narratives that converge on the experience of the Slavs. Ancient Greek texts, for instance, refer to terms like sklabano and sklabos, which denote captured peoples and, in many cases, specifically Slavic groups. The Greeks, much like the Romans who followed them, engaged in the practice of taking war captives, often integrating them into their economies as laborers, soldiers, or servants. These terms, embedded in the lexicons of ancient civilizations, crystallized a social reality in which being Slavic was not merely a matter of ethnicity or culture but, in certain contexts, a marker of vulnerability and commodification. The name itself became a reflection of the systemic and enduring nature of this enslavement, a subtle reminder that language can encode histories of power and subjugation that might otherwise be forgotten. The historical circumstances that led to this linguistic legacy are complex and deeply intertwined with the geography, politics, and social structures of medieval Europe. The Slavs, scattered across vast forests, river valleys, and plains of Eastern and Central Europe, often existed as small, loosely connected communities. Their lack of centralized political authority made them particularly susceptible to raids and conquest by neighboring empires and warlords seeking labor, tribute, or strategic advantage. From the Romans to the Byzantines, and later to Bulgars and other regional powers, Slavic peoples were repeatedly targeted, captured, and sold into slavery. Their fates determined not by their own actions, but by the ambitions of those who sought to harness their labor. The linguistic evidence, therefore, is not merely an artifact of language. It is a mirror reflecting the lived experiences of countless individuals whose identities were overshadowed by the circumstances of their enslavement. This connection between language and lived history becomes even more pronounced when we consider the social and economic functions of slavery in medieval Europe. Slavs were often enslaved for agricultural labor, constructing the material foundations of empires, cultivating lands that would support the wealth of distant rulers, and performing tasks that were both physically demanding and socially demeaning. In cities and towns, they could be found in domestic service, while in the military sphere, some were conscripted into armies or employed as personal retainers for powerful lords. Their labor was a crucial component of the economic and political machinery of the time, yet their humanity was systematically obscured by the very terminology used to describe them. To be called a Slav in certain contexts was to be identified not by culture, language, or kinship, but by a condition of captivity, a status imposed by others and perpetuated through generations. The Greek terms, which highlight notions of plunder and capture, further illuminate the nature of this historical enslavement. In many, the etymology underscores the perception of enslaved Slavs as spoils of war, objects to be claimed, traded, and exploited, rather than autonomous individuals with rights or agency. This framing was not limited to Greek or Roman societies. It echoed across medieval European realms, where legal codes, customary laws, and social norms codified the ownership and treatment of slaves, ensuring that the practice was embedded in both governance and culture. The linguistic traces of this system serve as a stark reminder that language can carry the weight of history, preserving insights into the power dynamics, social hierarchies, and human experiences that shaped the world. Understanding the etymology of slave in the context of Slavic history also invites reflection on the resilience and agency of those who lived under these conditions. While the word itself encodes suffering and subjugation, the lived experiences of enslaved Slavs were not monolithic. Many found ways to resist, adapt, and preserve elements of their cultural identity. Passing traditions, language, and social practices to subsequent generations despite the pressures of captivity. The endurance of Slavic communities, their languages, and their cultural practices demonstrates a remarkable capacity for survival and adaptation, reminding us that even in systems designed to dehumanize, human resilience can endure. Moreover, the linguistic connection between Slav and slave highlights broader patterns in the history of slavery across the world. It reminds us that slavery is not solely a modern or colonial phenomenon, but a recurring feature of human societies, arising wherever power imbalances, conquest, and economic incentives intersect. In the case of the Slavs, the very etymology of the word encapsulates centuries of interaction between conquerors and the conquered, revealing how language can preserve the memory of systemic injustice in ways that historical records alone may not fully convey. The story embedded in the word slave is thus both a cautionary tale and a historical insight. It underscores how entire populations can be reduced to commodities, how social hierarchies and power structures can define identity, and how human suffering can leave lasting marks not only on communities but also on the words we speak. Yet it also reminds us that within this history of exploitation, there exists a narrative of resilience, adaptation, and survival, showing that even when language reflects oppression, the lived reality of people is never fully contained by words alone. By tracing the origins of the term and linking it to the experiences of the Slavs, we gain a deeper understanding of how history, language, and human experience intertwine, offering a richer, more nuanced perspective on one of the most persistent and tragic institutions in human history. It is a story that calls for reflection, empathy, and an appreciation of the enduring strength of communities whose lives were shaped by forces far beyond their control. The story of the Slavs, scattered across the forests, rivers, and plains of Eastern and Central Europe, is inseparable from the broader narrative of human captivity and exploitation in antiquity and the early medieval period. For centuries, these communities were subjected to relentless incursions by empires and marauding armies, and the consequences of such invasions were often devastating. Slavs were captured and enslaved for a variety of purposes, their lives commodified and their freedom stripped away, and they were forced into roles that could be as grueling as they were dehumanizing. In Rome, for instance, some of these enslaved Slavs were pressed into military service, forming auxiliary units or serving as personal retainers for generals, while others were thrust into the spectacle of public entertainment, trained as gladiators, or used in theatrical exhibitions of strength and violence. These experiences highlight the multifaceted nature of slavery and the ways in which human labor, physical prowess, and even cultural identity could be co-opted to serve the demands of power, spectacle, and economic gain. The Roman perspective on conquest was inherently utilitarian. Captured populations were not only a source of labor, but also a mechanism through which the empire could consolidate its dominance and project power across vast territories. Slavs, like other enslaved peoples, were evaluated in terms of their utility and adaptability. Those with physical strength or combat skills could be trained as soldiers or gladiators, participating in contests that entertained the populace while simultaneously reinforcing the authority of the state. Others, deemed less physically suitable or valuable for martial roles, were distributed across agricultural estates, mines, and households, where their labor underpinned the economic infrastructure of the empire. In this system, human beings were reduced to instruments of labor, instruments whose very identities were overshadowed by the needs of conquest and governance. Yet their presence left an indelible mark on the cultural and social fabric of the empire. The treatment of Slavic captives was governed by a combination of legal codes, social norms, and economic imperatives. Enslaved individuals could be bought, sold, or exchanged, and families were often separated in the process. A disruption that extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect entire communities. Children born to enslaved parents inherited the status of their parents, ensuring that the cycle of subjugation persisted across generations. The Roman and later Byzantine systems of slavery were thus not merely episodic or ad hoc. They were structured institutions that shaped the lives, identities, and social possibilities of those caught within them. Slavs, captured in raids or military campaigns, were thrust into these systems with little recourse, their experiences reflecting broader patterns of vulnerability among dispersed and politically fragmented populations. Enslavement for entertainment, such as the role of gladiators, represents a particularly striking dimension of this history. Unlike laborers who contributed to agricultural output or infrastructure projects, gladiators were forced into a form of public spectacle that blended skill, violence, and ritualized death. Slavic captives who found themselves in the arenas were subjected to rigorous training, constant surveillance, and the ever-present threat of death. Their struggles performed for the amusement of spectators. These arenas were more than venues for sport. They were theaters of power, demonstrating the reach of Roman authority and the subjugation of those who had fallen under its control. For the enslaved, the arena was both a place of endurance and a site of erasure, where personal identity was subsumed beneath the imposed roles of combatant, performer, or spectacle. Yet even within these oppressive structures, the lives of enslaved Slavs were not without complexity. Some individuals managed to navigate the system in ways that allowed for limited social mobility or recognition of skill, particularly those with martial prowess or administrative acumen. For example, a captive trained as a gladiator or a soldier might, under rare circumstances, earn a degree of status or favor, illustrating that within the rigid hierarchies of enslavement, human agency could still manifest, however constrained it might be. These exceptions, while remarkable, underscore rather than diminish the fundamental injustice of the system. The vast majority of captives endured lives defined by coercion, violence, and deprivation. The historical reality of Slavic enslavement extends beyond Rome, continuing into the Byzantine period and beyond, where the demands of empire and military campaigns continued to produce captives for labor, military service, and social control. The Byzantine state, inheriting Roman administrative sophistication, perpetuated similar practices, often focusing on enslaving populations from borderlands, including Slavic communities. These enslaved individuals were integral to the functioning of both military and civil institutions, demonstrating once again how the imperatives of governance, economic productivity, and territorial control could dictate the fates of entire peoples. In this context, the experiences of the Slavs were emblematic of a broader human pattern, one in which political fragmentation, geographic dispersion, and strategic vulnerability rendered certain communities particularly susceptible to systemic exploitation. Examining the lives of enslaved Slavs provides insight into the broader mechanisms of slavery as an institution. Their labor, whether in fields, households, or arenas, illustrates the diverse purposes to which enslaved populations could be put and highlights the ways in which human lives were intertwined with the ambitions and fantasies of those in power. The physical and psychological toll of such subjugation was immense, yet the survival of Slavic cultures, languages, and traditions demonstrates the resilience of human communities under extraordinary pressure. Even when stripped of freedom and coerced into labor or spectacle, these populations retained elements of their identity, transmitted through family networks, oral histories, and cultural practice, ensuring that the legacy of their existence endured despite centuries of oppression. Through the lens of Slavic enslavement, we can see how systems of labor, military service, and entertainment were not isolated phenomena but interconnected strategies for sustaining empire. Projecting authority and exploiting human resources, the story of these individuals reminds us that the human cost of conquest and subjugation extends far beyond economic calculations, touching every aspect of life, identity, and community. It is a story of endurance amid oppression, of resilience amid systemic injustice, and of the enduring influence of historical practices on the cultural and social landscapes of Europe. As we move from the forests of Eastern Europe to the sprawling empires of the Middle East and North Africa, the story of slavery takes on a distinctly different, yet equally complex, character, reflecting the intersections of religion, ethnicity, and political power. In the Islamic world, from the earliest centuries of its expansion, slavery was not merely an economic institution, but a social system deeply entwined with legal, religious, and cultural norms. Non-Muslims living within or near these empires were particularly vulnerable, as religious identity became a primary determinant of who could be enslaved and who could claim protection under the law. In these societies, the act of enslavement was justified and structured through a framework that intertwined faith, conquest, and social hierarchy, creating a system in which entire populations could be classified and commodified based on the intersection of their beliefs and lineage. Children born to enslaved parents inherited the status of their parents, a practice that ensured the continuity of the system and expanded its reach across generations. In this way, slavery was not simply an episodic occurrence during periods of war or conquest. It became a durable institution, shaping the lives, possibilities, and identities of countless individuals from birth. Families were caught in a cycle of subjugation that limited their autonomy and shaped the social landscape of the regions under Islamic rule for centuries. The inheritance of slave status also meant that the system was self-perpetuating, requiring no further justification or reimposition with each new generation, thereby embedding the institution deeply into the social and economic fabric of these societies. The use of religion as a criterion for enslavement created a stark divide between those who could be enslaved and those who were afforded legal protection. Muslim populations were generally exempt from enslavement, yet non-Muslims, whether Christians, Jews, or adherents of other faiths, were deemed legitimate targets for capture, trade, and forced labor. This religious stratification illustrates how identity could be codified and exploited to facilitate large-scale human subjugation. Slavs, along with many other European Christians, found themselves ensnared in this system, transported across seas and deserts, and integrated into the labor forces, households, and military apparatus of distant empires. The intersection of ethnicity, religion, and political dominance thus dictated the contours of enslavement, revealing how systemic power operated through socially constructed hierarchies that extended far beyond local boundaries. Enslaved individuals were employed in diverse roles that underscored both their value and their vulnerability. Some were pressed into labor-intensive agricultural work, constructing the infrastructure that sustained cities and empires, while others were utilized in skilled trades or administrative roles, reflecting the multifaceted demands of complex societies. Military service was another avenue, particularly for male captives, who could be trained and incorporated into elite corps or other martial units, offering both a measure of social mobility and a constant reminder of their constrained agency. In other cases, enslaved women and children were placed in households, tasked with domestic labor, or integrated into social structures in ways that reinforced the authority of their owners. The wide range of roles occupied by enslaved individuals demonstrates how slavery operated as a comprehensive social institution, influencing every layer of society and embedding itself into the rhythms of daily life. Governance and economic production. Life under such a system was governed by a strict code of discipline, with punishments and incentives designed to maintain control and maximize utility. The consequences of disobedience or attempted escape were often severe, ranging from physical punishment to execution, a constant reminder of the precarity of freedom within this framework. At the same time, enslaved individuals could sometimes achieve limited recognition or advancement, particularly if they converted to Islam or demonstrated skills valuable to their owners, revealing that even within rigid structures, human agency could manifest in constrained but meaningful ways. These dynamics illustrate the complexity of the institution. While fundamentally oppressive, it allowed for degrees of negotiation, adaptation, and survival within the bounds established by empire and custom. The scale and duration of slavery in the Islamic world were remarkable. For centuries, these empires conducted extensive campaigns and maintained sophisticated networks for the capture, transport, and sale of enslaved individuals. Tens of millions were subjected to this system over the course of nearly a millennium, illustrating the enduring capacity of organized societies to systematize human exploitation across vast geographic regions. The experience of Slavs and other Europeans in this context highlights not only the geographic breadth of the institution, but also the ways in which cultural, religious, and social markers were utilized to classify and control populations, reflecting a deeply codified system of human hierarchy. Yet within this history of oppression, patterns of resilience and cultural persistence emerge. Families and communities found ways to transmit knowledge, beliefs, and traditions even while living under the constraints of slavery. Some enslaved individuals leveraged opportunities for education, military training, or administrative work to improve their circumstances, while others preserved the cultural practices of their homelands through oral storytelling. Religious observance, or communal solidarity. These acts of endurance, though often subtle, ensured that identity, memory, and cultural continuity persisted despite the structural violence and intergenerational nature of enslavement. The story of slavery in the Islamic world, particularly as it affected Slavs and other non-Muslims, provides a powerful lens through which to examine the ways in which human societies have historically codified and justified the subjugation of others. It demonstrates how religion and ethnicity could serve as organizing principles for systemic exploitation, how status could be inherited across generations, and how human ingenuity and resilience could persist even under the harshest conditions. By tracing these histories, we gain insight into the mechanisms of power, the complexity of social hierarchies, and the enduring impact of these practices on the course of human civilization, revealing a past that is as instructive as it is sobering. When considering the vast expanse of human history, the scope and duration of slavery in the Islamic world stand out not merely for their brutality, but for their staggering scale and persistence, extending nearly 9 centuries beyond the Atlantic African slave trade and impacting tens of millions of lives across continents. While the Atlantic slave trade often dominates discussions about historical slavery due to its profound effects on the Americas and European colonial powers, the Islamic system of enslavement, operating from the early medieval period well into the 20th century, eclipsed it in both longevity and geographic reach. Slavs from Eastern Europe, Africans from sub-Saharan regions, and countless other groups across Europe, North Africa, and the Indian Ocean were captured, transported, and integrated into social, economic, and military systems that were meticulously organized to sustain the practice over centuries. Unlike the comparatively brief but intense Atlantic trade, this longer-lasting institution created intergenerational patterns of bondage, embedding slavery into the very fabric of society and governance. The endurance of this system owes much to its adaptability and the way it was embedded in social, religious, and legal frameworks. Non-Muslims were particularly vulnerable to capture, whether through conquest, raids, or tributary obligations imposed on communities. Entire villages and towns could be swept into captivity, with men pressed into labor or military service, women assigned to households or domestic roles, and children inheriting the enslaved status of their parents. This continuity across generations meant that the system did not merely exploit labor temporarily. It systematically reproduced itself, creating populations whose social identity, economic contribution, and familial structures were all shaped by bondage. In this sense, the enslavement of Slavs, Africans, and other peoples was not a sporadic phenomenon, but a carefully maintained institution, one whose endurance depended on social codification, religious sanction, and organized networks of trade that spanned continents. The reach of this trade was immense. Slavs from Eastern Europe were taken during raids and military campaigns, transported across territories controlled by various Islamic powers, and incorporated into households, armies, or labor forces. Africans were captured through local and regional networks and transported across the Sahara, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, often destined for markets and cities far from their homelands. The sheer number of individuals caught in these systems is staggering, numbering in the tens of millions, with both European and African populations suffering under the same mechanisms of capture, transport, and integration. This comparative perspective reveals that while the Atlantic African slave trade is widely remembered, it was only one component of a global history of enslavement that had been evolving for centuries before European colonial powers arrived on the scene. Within this vast system, the experiences of enslaved individuals varied, yet common patterns of coercion, deprivation, and exploitation prevailed. Many were forced into labor-intensive agricultural work, maintaining estates, constructing infrastructure, or managing domestic and urban economies in ways that reinforced the power of their owners and the functioning of the state. Others were conscripted into military service, where they might serve as soldiers, naval rowers, or elite guard unit, roles that could confer some measure of skill or status, but never true autonomy. For women and children, the demands of domestic labor and integration into households created both vulnerability and opportunity. Some women, for example, gained influence within the confines of their environments, while children often inherited a life structured entirely by the constraints imposed upon their parents. The system was meticulously organized, ensuring that the human resources it exploited could be maintained, managed, and reproduced over centuries. The social and cultural ramifications of such a long-lasting system were profound. Families and communities were repeatedly disrupted, traditions challenged, and languages threatened. Yet resilience persisted. Enslaved populations found ways to preserve identity, maintain networks of kinship, and transmit cultural knowledge despite the conditions of bondage. Oral traditions, religious practices, and communal solidarity provided a framework for continuity, demonstrating that even within structures designed to erase autonomy, the human spirit found avenues for endurance. The narrative of enslaved Slavs, Africans, and other groups illustrates a recurring theme in human history: the tension between systemic oppression and individual or collective resilience, where survival is not merely physical but also cultural and psychological. Legally and administratively, Islamic powers sustained these networks through codified practices and institutional oversight. Slave markets were established in major cities, complete with regulations on trade, ownership, and the treatment of enslaved persons, and the transport of captives across vast distances was facilitated by established caravans, fleets, and regional intermediaries. The predictability and regulation of these systems allowed slavery to endure far longer than in Western contexts, where changing economic models, social attitudes, and legal reforms eventually curtailed large-scale enslavement. The organizational sophistication of these empires, combined with religious and social sanction, ensured that slavery was not a temporary phenomenon but a durable, intergenerational institution that touched millions of lives across diverse regions. The ethical and historical lessons of this prolonged system are manifold. While it demonstrates the capacity of empires to institutionalize human exploitation, it also highlights the resilience of those subjected to such conditions and the ways in which cultural and personal identity can survive even in the face of centuries of systemic oppression. Understanding this history challenges simplified narratives that frame slavery solely in terms of Atlantic or European contexts, revealing a more nuanced and global perspective that situates the Atlantic trade as one episode within a much broader continuum of human bondage. By examining the extended duration, the vast numbers involved, and the cross-cultural impact of this system, we gain a deeper understanding of how slavery has shaped societies over millennia. The story of enslaved Slavs, Africans, and countless others reminds us that history is not merely a record of events, but a reflection of enduring human patterns, the consequences of power unrestrained, and the remarkable capacity of individuals and communities to survive, adapt, and maintain identity under extraordinary circumstances. In recognizing the scale and longevity of this system, we are compelled to confront both the suffering it caused and the resilience it engendered, creating a fuller, more nuanced comprehension of humanity's past. By the mid-15th century, the landscape of global slavery was entering a new and profoundly consequential chapter, one shaped by the maritime ambitions of the Iberian powers, Spain and Portugal, driven by the intertwined motives of economic expansion, religious fervor, and territorial conquest, became the dominant forces in the transatlantic slave trade, creating networks that would link Africa, Europe, and the Americas in a complex web of human exploitation. Their ventures along the western coast of Africa were meticulously planned and aggressively pursued, marking the beginning of an era in which the capture, transport, and forced labor of African populations would reach unprecedented scales. Unlike the systems of enslavement in Eastern Europe or the Islamic world, which had endured for centuries and spanned vast territories, this European-driven trade was concentrated on the transatlantic axis and closely tied to the emerging plantation economies of the New World, particularly in sugar, tobacco, and later cotton. The Portuguese were among the first to navigate the dangerous waters of the West African coast, establishing forts, trading posts, and alliances that enabled them to acquire captives through both purchase and coercion. These outposts became hubs of commerce where local intermediaries, often African rulers or merchants, played pivotal roles in supplying slaves to European traders. The system was highly organized. Individuals were selected, inspected, and transported on ships that were often overcrowded, unsanitary, and perilous, with mortality rates that were tragically high. The scale and efficiency of this operation demonstrated the emerging European capacity to exert influence far beyond their borders, and it set a model that other European powers would soon emulate and expand upon. Spain, meanwhile, directed its attention toward the Americas, where colonies in the Caribbean and Central and South America demanded vast labor forces to cultivate sugarcane and other crops. The Iberian powers quickly realized that enslaved Africans could provide the labor required to sustain these economies, and the trade became both a mechanism of economic exploitation and a driver of European imperial expansion. As the Portuguese and Spanish carved out dominance, other European nations soon joined the trade, drawn by the lucrative potential of controlling human labor on transatlantic plantations. England, France, and the Netherlands, initially peripheral players, gradually became active participants, establishing their own networks, trading posts, and colonies in the Americas. The English, entering the trade more than a century after the Iberians, brought with them the organizational methods, navigational expertise, and mercantile systems that enabled them to capture a significant share of the African slave market. Over time, these European powers collectively transported millions of Africans across the Atlantic, fundamentally transforming the demographic, social, and economic landscapes of multiple continents. This transatlantic trade, while shorter in duration than the centuries-long enslavement of Slavs in Eastern Europe or the prolonged Islamic slave trade, had a profound and enduring impact due to the scale of human displacement, the intensity of labor exploitation, and the creation of racially codified systems of social hierarchy. The human experiences within this trade were harrowing and multifaceted. Captives were often taken from inland regions through raids, wars, or local trading systems, and then forced to march to coastal ports under brutal conditions. Upon arrival, they were packed onto ships for the Middle Passage, a journey marked by overcrowding, disease, malnutrition, and violence. Many perished before reaching the Americas, and those who survived faced a lifetime of forced labor on plantations, in mines, or in domestic servitude. Children born into these systems inherited the enslaved status of their parents, continuing the cycle of bondage and embedding the consequences of the trade deeply into families, communities, and emerging colonial society. The social and psychological toll was immense, with disrupted family structures, loss of cultural continuity, and pervasive trauma that reverberated across generations. Economically, the Iberian dominance of the African slave trade transformed global commerce. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean became engines of wealth for European powers, reliant on the coarse labor of enslaved Africans. Portugal, with its control over strategic ports and trading posts, gained unprecedented influence over African commerce, while Spain's colonies benefited from the integration of enslaved labor into agricultural and mining enterprises. This system created interdependencies between continents. European markets demanded colonial products, colonial economies relied on African labor, and African intermediaries engaged in complex negotiations with European traders. The trade was not only a mechanism of exploitation, but also a catalyst for global interconnectedness, linking distant regions through the movement of people, goods, and capital, albeit a staggering human cost. Culturally, the effects of Iberian dominance were profound. Enslaved Africans brought with them languages, religious practices, agricultural knowledge, and artisanal skills that profoundly influenced colonial societies. Despite the attempts of European powers to suppress and control these populations, enslaved communities preserved elements of their heritage, adapted to new environments, and created distinct cultural forms that merged African traditions with local influences. This resilience highlights the agency of enslaved individuals within systems designed to strip them of autonomy, revealing how human creativity and cultural endurance can survive even under extreme oppression. In examining the Iberian role in the African slave trade, one can see the continuation of patterns that were evident in earlier systems of slavery, from the enslavement of Slavs in Europe to the extensive Islamic trade networks. European powers were, in a sense, latecomers to an institution that had existed in various forms for centuries. Yet they intensified its scale and global reach through maritime technology, organized colonial ventures, and economic incentives tied to emerging capitalist structures. The Iberian dominance set the stage for centuries of transatlantic exploitation, shaping societies on 3 continents and leaving legacies that continue to influence social, cultural, and economic patterns to this day. Ultimately, the story of Spanish and Portuguese hegemony in the African slave trade is one of strategic planning, brutal efficiency, profound human consequences. It is a chapter in a larger narrative of global enslavement, connecting earlier histories of bondage with the emerging dynamics of European colonialism and demonstrating how economic ambition, technological capacity, and social ideology can intersect to produce systems of unprecedented human suffering. By understanding this period in its broader historical context, we gain insight not only into the mechanics of the trade itself, but also into the resilience, adaptation, and enduring cultural legacies of those who survived it. The formal abolition of slavery across the globe unfolded unevenly, revealing a patchwork of legal, social, and cultural factors that dictated how and under what circumstances enslaved populations could finally attain freedom, a process that unfolded over centuries and across continents. While European nations gradually dismantled legalized systems of bondage during the 18th and 19th centuries, often driven by economic shifts, moral debates, and political pressure, regions under Islamic governance frequently maintained legal slavery for far longer, with some areas continuing practices well into the 20th century. The discrepancy in timelines highlights the complex interplay of law, religion, economy, and tradition, and illustrates that the cessation of slavery was neither universal nor instantaneous, but a protracted process shaped by local contexts and imperial priorities. In Europe and its colonies, the trajectory toward abolition was influenced by the rise of industrial economies, philosophical movements advocating human rights, and the persistent resistance of enslaved and formerly enslaved people themselves. Legislative milestones such as Britain's Slave Trade Act of 1807, which outlawed the transatlantic trade, and the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which emancipated most enslaved individuals in the British Empire, reflected both moral awakening and economic pragmatism. France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands enacted comparable reforms over the course of the 19th century, signaling the end of legal enslavement for millions in colonies from the Caribbean to South America. Yet even as European nations moved toward abolition, enforcement remained inconsistent, and in some regions, informal forms of forced labor and quasi-slavery persisted, demonstrating that legal decrees alone could not immediately dismantle entrenched social and economic systems. Across the Islamic world, the timeline of abolition was often extended by the enduring integration of slavery into social, legal, and military structures. The Ottoman Empire, for example, maintained institutionalized slavery well into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, relying on networks of enslavement for both labor and military service, including the elite Janissary Corps that had originated centuries earlier from enslaved Christian boys. Although reformist movements and changing international norms prompted gradual legal prohibitions, such as Sultan Abdul Hamid I's release of personal slaves in 1909 and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's formal abolition in the Turkish Republic, full compliance and enforcement lagged behind legislation. Other regions under Islamic influence, including parts of North and East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, similarly retained legal slavery into the mid-20th century, with Saudi Arabia only officially ending the practice in 1962. The longevity of legal slavery in these regions reflects both the embeddedness of the institution within social and economic life and the broader international context, where enforcement of anti-slavery norms was uneven and often influenced by geopolitical considerations. The persistence of slavery into the 20th century underscores the human consequences of institutional inertia. Generations born into bondage continued to experience the limitations, deprivations, and social hierarchies associated with enslavement long after European abolitionists had achieved legislative victories. In regions such as the Ottoman Empire and the Arabian Peninsula, the institution had become deeply interwoven with the structure of households, military units, and local economies, making eradication a complex process that required not only legal reform but also social adaptation. Economic substitution and cultural negotiation. Families who had been enslaved for generations faced the dual challenge of legal freedom and the task of navigating a society that had long defined them through subjugation, illustrating that abolition was not merely a matter of law but a transformative social endeavor. Beyond the formal decrees, enforcement and societal attitudes played a critical role in shaping outcomes. Even after abolition laws were enacted, illegal enslavement persisted in many areas, with clandestine markets, coercive labor practices, and social pressures continuing to limit freedom and autonomy. Enforcement often depended on the capacity of state authorities, local compliance, and the presence of alternative labor systems capable of replacing enslaved labor without disrupting economic productivity. These factors reveal that while legislation was essential, it was insufficient on its own to eliminate entrenched forms of exploitation, and that social, economic, and cultural dimensions of slavery had to be addressed to achieve meaningful change. The human stories embedded in the final decades of legal slavery are both poignant and instructive. Enslaved individuals and families navigated a world in transition, sometimes negotiating new forms of labor contracts, leveraging social connections, or utilizing local protections to secure relative autonomy. Others continued to endure coercion and violence, highlighting the unevenness of progress and the limits of legal reform in the face of entrenched social hierarchies. Across the Islamic world and beyond, the experiences of those living under late legal slavery illustrate the profound impact of institutional continuity, the resilience of human communities, and the gradual, often contested, nature of social transformation. Comparing these timelines with European abolition illustrates how global systems of slavery were not uniform in their emergence or demise. While Europe's legal and economic structures evolved relatively quickly to eliminate formal bondage, the Islamic world's prolonged reliance on slavery reflected a combination of religious, social, and institutional factors that slowed the process of abolition. These divergent trajectories highlight the need to understand slavery not as a monolithic institution but as a multifaceted system whose endurance and dissolution were shaped by local contexts, imperial priorities, and the interplay of law, economy, and culture. Ultimately, the staggered timeline of abolition across the globe underscores the complexity of human societies grappling with entrenched systems of exploitation. The experience of enslaved populations in Islamic regions, enduring legal bondage long after European reforms, reminds us that the legacies of slavery extend far beyond the enactment of laws and into the social, cultural, and economic fabric of affected communities. It demonstrates that freedom, while a legal milestone, is also a process of reconstruction, adaptation, and negotiation, requiring both systemic change and human resilience. By tracing these histories, we gain insight not only into the mechanics of slavery itself, but also into the enduring capacity of human societies to confront injustice, reform institutions, and navigate the long, often uneven path toward equality and dignity. As we draw this journey through the vast and often painful history of slavery to a close, it becomes clear that slavery was not a phenomenon confined to a single race, culture, or continent, but a global, systemic institution shaped by the interplay of politics, religion, and economics, impacting millions of lives over centuries. From the early enslavement of Slavic peoples in Eastern and Central Europe, to the centuries-long Islamic slave networks that reached across Africa, Europe, and the Indian Ocean, to the transatlantic trade dominated by European powers, the story of slavery is woven into the fabric of human history in ways both complex and far-reaching. It was a system that transcended borders and epochs, taking different forms depending on local customs, religious doctrines, and economic imperatives, yet leaving a consistent imprint on societies across the globe. The legal, social, and cultural consequences of this institution endured long after the formal abolition of slavery, influencing demographic patterns, social hierarchies, and collective memory. Slavery's global nature reminds us that the exploitation of human beings has often been normalized and institutionalized under varying justifications. In Europe, it was entwined with the expansion of empires and the emergence of plantation economies in the Americas. In the Islamic world, it was incorporated into legal and military structures, where non-Muslims were often enslaved and children inherited their parents' status. And across Africa, the trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trades created vast networks of human trafficking long before European intervention. Each of these systems, though differing in scale, method, and rationale, demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of slavery as an institution, capable of embedding itself deeply into political, religious, and economic frameworks. Yet within these structures, the human experience of slavery displacement, forced labor, cultural disruption, and the struggle for survival remained a constant. People were uprooted from their homes, families were torn apart, and communities had to find ways to endure under circumstances designed to suppress autonomy and identity. Despite these hardships, history also tells of resilience, adaptation, and survival. Across continents and centuries, enslaved individuals and communities found ways to preserve elements of culture, sustain society, and transmit knowledge to future generations. Oral traditions, religious practices, and communal solidarity became tools of resistance, helping to retain identity in the face of relentless exploitation. This resilience reminds us that, while slavery attempted to strip away autonomy and humanity, it could not entirely erase the innate drive for self-preservation, dignity, and community. It also highlights that human history is not solely a record of oppression but also of endurance and ingenuity, showing that even in the darkest circumstances, people found ways to adapt and survive. Understanding the global scope of slavery reshapes the way we view both the past and its legacies today. It encourages a broader, more nuanced perspective that moves beyond simplified narratives focused solely on one region or one people. Recognizing the shared experiences of enslaved populations across diverse societies illuminates patterns of power, exploitation, and resistance, revealing connections that span continents and centuries. It also deepens our awareness of the systemic nature of inequality, showing how entrenched economic, political, and social structures can perpetuate human suffering and marginalization. This understanding is essential not just for historians but for anyone seeking to grapple with the long-term consequences of slavery, including persistent social disparities, cultural memory, and the ongoing struggle for human rights and dignity. As we reflect on this complex history, it is important to remember that learning from the past is a vital step toward creating a more just and empathetic present. By examining how slavery operated as a global system, how it was justified, enforced, and resisted, we gain insight into the mechanisms of oppression and the resilience of those subjected to it. This perspective equips us to recognize modern forms of exploitation, whether in human trafficking, forced labor, or systemic inequality, and to advocate for justice, equity, and the protection of human dignity in contemporary societies. It is a reminder that history is not merely a series of events, but a mirror reflecting human capacity for both cruelty and courage, exploitation and endurance. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of the most significant and far-reaching institutions in human history. If you found this journey informative and thought-provoking, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video so that more people can learn about the interconnected and global story of slavery. By engaging with this history, we honor the experiences of those who lived through it and ensure that their stories are not forgotten. Your support allows us to continue uncovering the lessons of the past and sharing them in ways that are meaningful, respectful, and educational. As you close this chapter and prepare to rest, remember that understanding history is a continuous process, one that deepens our empathy and strengthens our commitment to justice. May the stories of endurance, resilience, and survival inspire reflection and growth as you move forward. Sleep well, knowing that by learning from the past, we contribute to a more aware, compassionate, and thoughtful future. Good night, and take care of yourself as you drift into rest.